Welcome to the Employer Branding Show, interviews with employer branding and recruitment practitioners to help you kickstart your hiring efforts. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. We're joined by Toby Mildon, who's the diversity and inclusion architect and founder of Mildon, a boutique diversity and inclusion consultancy. Toby, great to have you on the show.
Great to see you, James. Thanks for inviting me.
Not a problem. So for those of us who don't know Toby, you and your story, can you share a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I run my own diversity and inclusion consultancy now. I work with heads of HR and business leaders to create their diversity and inclusion strategies so that they can create a more inclusive culture and attract a diverse workforce to come and work for them and benefit from the advantages of having a diverse team. Before I set up my own company, though, I worked in-house in corporate life. So I was a diversity and inclusion manager for the BBC. And then I went to become a diversity manager for Deloitte, one of the big four accountancy firms.
Fantastic. And now you're running your own company, helping other companies do their thing in this space. We spoke a little bit before coming on air that you're busier than ever at the moment. Why do you think that is happening now?
It's a combination of things. We've seen a lot of changes happen in society recently, where organisations have had to think quite hard about how they respond so that their staff feel heard and that they're respected and that they belong. So a couple of years ago, after the murder of George Floyd in the States, we saw the Black Lives Matter movement really pick up, and organisations having to think about how they become anti-racist organisations. We've seen the disproportionate impact of the pandemic and lockdowns on certain members of our society, and again how organisations respond to that as well. So there's been a combination of things that have really happened.
I speak to a lot of recruiters, heads of talent at startups that are trying to grow fast, trying to hire large amounts of people. And often the first question that a candidate asks of a company is actually around their DE&I strategy or policies, etc. And you're speaking about being an anti-racist company there. Do you think most companies are equipped to handle that, or are what they're saying actually meaningful in their answers to those kind of questions?
I don't think that a lot of companies are as well equipped as they really should be. You've raised an interesting point, and what we're noticing is that younger people, in particular, are very interested in diversity and inclusion and equality, and not just human equality, but also looking at things like environmental impact, working for an organisation that has got a strong purpose in it. So they are attracted to those organisations. So those organisations that can demonstrate that they have a purpose and that they are responsible and they look after people are better magnets for talent, if I'm being honest. And one of the things that's interestingly, startups and scale-ups, they often don't think that they have the resources to do a good job on diversity and inclusion, because they think it's what the big companies are doing with big budgets, but that's not necessarily true. I work with small companies. My smallest client is a training company. They employ 21 staff. I work with a boutique change management consultancy. They've got 10 staff on the payroll, and then they've got a whole team of associates that deliver their services. But both of those organizations can actually have a profound impact on the culture of their organization by doing some really simple things that don't necessarily have to cost a lot of money. And startups and scale-ups have to really think seriously about diversity and inclusion, because if they don't get the culture right at the beginning of their business, it will bite them in the bum later on. And we've seen that with Uber. Uber in the early days just threw money at the product and didn't pay a lot of attention to the culture or the behavior that was going on in the business. And then we saw some really damaging headlines that was damaging their employer brand because of the misogyny and the sexual harassment that was going on within the business.
So you mentioned that startups and scale-ups have an opportunity to implement DE&I in the right kind of way. If we were talking to someone who's head of talent at the moment, they're responsible for hiring lots of people, sourcing where those people come from, because nobody's applying for job adverts at the moment. They're responsible for actually managing a recruitment workflow, maybe creating employer branding, and making sure that they're attracting a diverse workforce as well. These people are stretched thin.
Yeah.
Where do they start? What are the things they can do from day one to support that whole project?
So the first thing to say is that focusing on diversity and inclusion shouldn't necessarily add any additional workload to what you're already doing, because you just outlined there a lot of things that heads of talent or heads of HR need to be thinking about. And all that we suggest really is do what you do in terms of business as usual, in terms of attracting talent, running your recruitment process, and such like, but just have a diversity and inclusion lens or layer over the top of it. So if we look at talent attraction, for example, just ask yourself, where are we going to get our talent? Where else could we go? If we're going to a limited pool, how could we broaden that pool? How could we widen the outreach that we do? How can we cast our net wider to try and capture more people? Even if you look at your recruitment process, for example, just pick it apart and ask yourself at each stage of the recruitment process, where might bias come in? How can we make the recruitment process easier, more accessible, more inclusive? And it's those really important questions that help improve the inclusivity of these systems.
So if I'm sourcing for a role, like as a recruiter, most recruiters, what they would do is they'd get a job description, they'd put an advert up, which is basically going to be the same as the job description they've got. They probably won't have time to write anything unique. And then they start searching on LinkedIn by using different parameters, and then they just send out some messages to people to attract people. Now, to me, all of that is just like kind of basic recruitment stuff, but there's no lens aligned with that, and they probably don't have the time to do that. How could a job description look different? How could a search for people look different? And how could outreach to people look different?
This is where technology can help us.
Okay.
And there's gendered language often used in job adverts and job descriptions that may be appealing or not appealing to certain sections of our society. So using terms like, aggressive, for example, can often be unappealing to women. So a quick hack, if you like, is to use a tool like Textio, Textio. And what you do is you just copy and paste your job ad and your job description into the text box, and they scan your document and they tell you which words are appealing and not appealing and suggest alternative words. They also look for things that just make the likelihood of somebody clicking on the Apply Now button better. So they look at whether you've actually made reference to diversity and inclusion, whether you're using too many buzzwords, whether the length of the job advert is too long, so people don't, get to the end. So that that's a quick and easy thing that can be done.
That's wonderful, and that's the outreach part of things. And I love a hack, by the way. You need to make life as easy as possible for recruiters,
Yeah.
really. So that sounds as though that will help the outreach and the language that's used there. Then you get to a point where people are interviewing. So people are talking to recruiters, talking to hiring managers, and then we get into the world of unconscious bias. I was just reading Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by Daniel Kahneman.
Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman. Yeah.
I could see the word. I couldn't figure out how to say it out loud. And how we all rely on biases to make the world an easier place, but that really kind of runs up against the DE&I. If you're trying to be more diverse and inclusive, but then you've got these unconscious biases that are impacting your decision making matrices.
Yeah.
You can see how I'm a simple guy from Harlow, but people might get confused.
Yeah. I mean, when we're looking at doing job interviews, bias is one of the things that can affect our decision making. There's been a lot of talk about whether unconscious bias training is effective or not, for example. And it really depends what your expectations are, because if your expectation is that you're going to change behaviors and eradicate bias, then unconscious bias training will not help you, because our biases are so ingrained in us. It's the product of how our brains are wired, and it's the product of social conditioning. Mm-hmm. So unless you can wind back the clock to when you're a baby and try and unlearn everything that you've learned up to the present day, then it's really, really, it's impossible to undo this. If the purpose of the training is just to raise awareness so that people can be more conscious about how our biases affect our decision making, and then think about how they can interrupt any patterns of bias to arrive at better outcomes or decision making, then that's a perfectly good, acceptable outcome. Now, a framework that I like to use when I talk about bias with my clients was created by the Neuro Leadership Institute in the States, and it's called the SEEDS model, and it's an acronym for 5 different types of bias. And so I use that as a checklist with my clients. So, for instance, the S of SEEDS stands for similarity, which says that we have a preference for what is like us over what is different, and we create in-groups and out-groups, and we maybe over-appreciate the skills and abilities of people in our in-group, and we might overlook the skills and abilities of people in our out-group. And just having a conversation with clients about that is really powerful in terms of their recruitment. If they're doing an interview, it might be that they just naturally click with people who grew up in the same part of the world as them, or went to a similar school or university as them. And then we can say, okay, now that you've got that awareness, what could you consciously do to try and counteract that blind spot? So it might be, deliberately spend 5 minutes with every candidate before the interview to find some common ground, find something that you have in connection with one another. So that's the kinds of things that we could explore in the recruitment process.
Just saying that out loud and just being able to recognize it and think about the similarities that you might have with someone, and that if that creates a positive the positive link in to someone, that makes perfect sense. I remember, years ago when I was a recruiter, you'd walk into consultancies and everybody would look the same, and they would only interview people that looked almost exactly the same as them. And it was that was just what happened. But now that just by talking about it, people are going to become more aware and hopefully make better decisions from that. Something I speak to people a lot about is the Oxbridge problem, which I don't know if I'm describing it correctly, but no one ever got fired for hiring someone from Oxbridge. because there's no risk associated with that. Do you see that sometimes coming up from clients where they say, well, we want to hire from outside of a traditional background? I don't even know if that's the right terminology, but it's too risky. We want to hire this person over here because we kind of know where they're coming from. But I'm not sure what the terminology is to describe that. Is that something that gets raised at all?
It comes up a lot. It's a combination of other biases. So there could be a similarity bias there that because you maybe went to a Russell Group university, that is shaping your perception of the world, which you believe to be objectively true. But the problem with an experience bias, is that we falsely think that we accurately see the world, and then we base decisions on what we falsely think is true. So it's a bit of a tongue twister. And so if you've been to a Russell Group university, for example, you go into that decision making with that experience and that perception in mind. And also, quite often we get safety bias comes up as well. So that's the last S of seeds. And safety bias is where we have we want to kind of protect ourselves against losses more than we seek out gains.
Yeah.
And in recruitment, we might hear people say things like, well, I just need a safe pair of hands. I need somebody who can just come in and hit the ground running, not rock the boat. Somebody who's a culture fit for the organization. If ever you hear any of those terms, then you've got some safety bias on your hands to deal with.
That's the most common. Well, that's the one that I'm probably most aware of. And my background, I used to do a lot of apprenticeship recruitment, and it was and you could see people hiring who they recognised, you remind me of a young me. Like it was that conversation happened a lot, and also, it's a bit of a risk to do something like this, so we have to make sure that they fit it. It's incredible, those elements. And is there statistics or any kind of facts or stories that show that by hiring using some of the strategies that you're discussing, that improves output, or what's the measure there of using that, or is that a useful discussion to have at all? Is that not the point?
There is now tons of research and evidence from various academics and professional services companies to demonstrate that a more diverse workforce gets you better results, a better performing business. You are better at decision making because you get away from groupthink and you move away from your blind spots. You come up with more creative ideas, better at problem solving. You can better anticipate the needs of your customers because you have better empathy with a diverse range of customers. You can even win and lose business. I work with clients who are losing business because their potential clients are asking them what they're doing about diversity and inclusion, and they sit there with a very blank expression on their face going, we're not doing a lot here. And that client, because it's important to them, it's of high value to them, are going and working with other companies. So there's a huge impact in getting this right.
And it's also the right thing to do. Like as much as there's the facts that prove the point, this should be happening anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the ethical thing to do. It's the right thing to do. And I work with loads of senior leaders, chief executives who say that. They say it's the right thing to do. It aligns with our values as an organization. And why are we not walking the talk? Why are we not being congruent with our values?
Yeah. A thought just comes to mind. There's been a lot of redundancies recently in the tech world, internationally, a lot of big businesses. And is there anything from a DE&I perspective that you should consider? Obviously, there's the HR conversation, like the pure HR about what you're legally allowed to do, but there are more considerations for offboarding people that companies could take, or a lens that people could apply there in that process. Sorry for putting you on the spot there, but it's just something that's quite in the news at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, whenever you make any major decisions, including laying people off or even relocating people from one part of the country to the other or to another part of the world, it's really important to do an equality impact assessment to see whether certain members of your organization are more at risk than others. I'll give you an example. I worked with an organization and we were closing an office in London and we were moving people to another part of the UK. And what we realized after we started doing the relocation program was that disabled people were probably disproportionately impacted by that relocation, because disabled people would have their kind of social care and their medical support network around them. So it was quite disruptive to relocate. Maybe they live in an accessible home, and it's very difficult to find accessible accommodation, with equipment and things like that. So it was a real ask to ask people to relocate. So, but we didn't have any additional support in place. We had a kind of a bog standard relocation package with a relocation company helping us without any additional support for disabled staff. So we then realised that, having done an equality impact assessment and then understanding that there was this disproportionate impact on disabled staff, that we needed to do more to support them. And we started putting more kind of measurement in place.
It's great that was raised. I'm talking to a lot of people at the moment about how to judge businesses, how to judge employer brands, and my kind of reverse about face way of saying a good way of assessing an employer is to see how they treat ex-employees.
Yeah.
And because if they think about that part of it, then you can be pretty certain that the rest is being kind of looked after, because this is like when everything's gone bad, basically. So that's a really interesting point. And I wonder if Musk, who's coming in and talking about 75% redundancies at Twitter, is thinking about that at all. Probably not. I'll say that, Toby, just in case there are of yours. I don't want you missing out on a huge commission.
I'm really not sure what's going on at Twitter, so I couldn't comment on that, to be honest.
Okay, fair enough. I've just got, Toby, I could talk to you for hours about this. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I hope anybody listening to this is appreciating the kind of angles and the lenses. I love that terminology that they can apply to their own work. There, I've got some kind of quick fire questions that I think might be interesting to go through. Is that okay, Toby?
Yeah, I'm up for that.
So I normally ask people what tech stack they use for their employer branding, but are there? You've already mentioned one piece of technology. Are there any like tech stack that you think that is particularly useful for people to use for diversity and inclusion programs or processes that they're trying to implement?
Yeah, definitely. There's loads, and I'm a self-confessed geek because I used to work in technology before I got into diversity and inclusion, and that's how I got into it. Like I was a project manager in tech for years, and then when I was at the BBC, the leadership team realised that we had a gender imbalance within tech. So we had way more men working in technology than women, which is a common issue within the technology and engineering industry. So I worked with the leadership team to address that gender imbalance. So I'm a bit of a geek, and there's loads of technologies that can help us. And in fact, it's because of that background that I included it as a chapter in my book, which is called Cyber. And it's all about how technology can help scale up our efforts on D&I, but also the importance of accessibility. So making sure that any externally facing tech, like a website or an app, can be used by as many people as possible, but also the internal tools and systems that often get overlooked. So any like learning management system or intranet or conferencing systems like Zoom or that kind of thing are all accessible. There's a few favorites, and I mentioned a few of my favorites in my book. So I've already mentioned Textio. There's things like apps that, in my own podcast, I interviewed the founders of, they're called Enboarder, Enboarder. They're an onboarding app, and they facilitate the beginnings of a relationship between a new employee and the business and the line manager. And we talked about how you can use Enboarder, for example, to introduce or start to talk about diversity and inclusion. So you could ask new employees what adjustments they need, what their preferred working style is like, whether they need flexibility because they're a parent, that kind of thing. You could also start to share with new employees information about like employee networks they can join. Like lots of organizations have networks like Women in Tech or Women in Leadership or ethnicity groups or disability groups. So you can start to promote those groups to your new staff, and that's a really great way of starting to really build up your employer brand and your employee value proposition. So there's an example. A lot of my clients pay attention to what people are saying on Glassdoor and LinkedIn and Indeed, making sure that they represent or they respond to any comments that people leave and address anything that might be damaging their employer brand. To be honest with you, I could go on and on forever about different technology because there's so much in the tech stack that you could use.
But the ones that you've spoken about there are really interesting. So I think we'll definitely link up to is it Textio and Textio, sorry, and Enboarder.
Yeah.
Because I think for anybody that's starting their employer branding journey, thinking about DE&I using these technologies, both of those parts are going to really impact the larger picture if they implement them earlier in their journey rather than later on. That's really interesting. I'm sorry to bring him up again, but I don't know if you saw the Musk tweet where he said that he got an automated email inviting him to manager training when he joined as a director of Twitter. Did you see that at all?
I didn't see that. No.
Yeah. Well, he tweeted it out as a very facetious kind of, hey, this company's broken. I'm getting this automated email, but actually, it was quite a nice onboarding little message. But maybe it's a bit too automated.
I didn't see that.
Yeah, I'll send you a link to that so you can check that out. Okay. So next question. What would be your most recommended books to a recruiter or someone in employer branding about thinking about the diversity and inclusion for startups and scale-ups?
I'm going to be cheeky here.
You can be very cheeky, Toby.
I'm going to recommend my own book.
Yes.
So my own book is called Inclusive Growth. And the reason why I'm recommending my own book is because I talk about employer branding in the final chapter of the book. And I make a couple of points. First of all, the reason why it's at the end of the book is because a lot of organizations think about kind of their external profile and try to go out and win awards and think about how they present to the world without doing any of the hard work in creating an inclusive culture. So when somebody does arrive in your organization, it doesn't quite match up with the image that's being projected. So I say in my book, I say, you need to do the hard work first so that you have an authentic brand and authentic employee value proposition that you can communicate to the rest of the world. And I also talk about how employer branding fits into kind of a broader framework for inclusion. So there's 6 other things that we really need to be thinking about when it comes to creating an inclusive work environment. We need to be really clear on why DNI is important and having data and evidence to support the business case and create that business case. We have to come up with a plan and a strategy and have effective change management for delivering change. We need to be really human-centric, and we need to be thinking about like the human-centered experience, or the human-centered experience, and how we create those inclusive employee journeys. How technology can help you, and the importance of having accessible tech. And then also how you collaborate as a whole organization, because D&I is often seen as like the HR department's responsibility, but D&I touches every corner of the business. Your marketing people need to be thinking about how diverse their campaigns are. Your workplace people need to be thinking about the accessibility of your offices. Procurement should be thinking about what suppliers they're working with and whether they're working with a diverse range of suppliers. So it's a real collaborative effort across the whole business.
I love that collaborative angle. The thing with, I know some companies, I've been hearing about some companies that have HR not as a department, but actually individual managers own that throughout the business. I'm trying to think, distributed probably is the right kind of terminology there. So managers have all got training so that they are delivering this in the right kind of way. And it's the same with employer brand, I think. Is employer brand shouldn't be owned by the employer brander and the CEO or the founder of the business. It should be everybody's responsibility within that. We will link to your book, Toby. Don't worry about that.
Thank you.
And I will make a point of reading it as well, because I think there's some really interesting crossovers there and some conversations that would be worth having with different businesses.
But I will share with you one of my favourite books, because I was being quite cheeky there.
You've got another one. Fans, brilliant.
Yeah, and I didn't write this one. No, one of my favourite sort of books, it's not really strictly diversity and inclusion, but it's Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, who talks. It's a really good book about our biases and our blind spots, because the famous book you've already mentioned is Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and it's quite a heavy read. It's quite academic, because Daniel Kahneman is an academic. He's over in the States, but the Blink by Malcolm Gladwell is such an easy read. It's worth picking up a copy.
Brilliant. I haven't read Blink. I'm sure I've read lots of his other books, but I haven't read Blink yet, so I will have a look at that. The biases, the angle, it's interesting about how useful they are, and also what an obstacle they are at the same time. Often they kind of get in our way and help us not go crazy in the world. Really interesting.
Biases are just shortcuts in the brain. They can help us in some situations, but they can hinder us in others. And they're neither good nor bad. They just are.
Good way of looking at it, Toby. Perfect. Okay, last question. Who is an up-and-comer in DE&I, recruitment, employer branding, that you think we should be keeping an eye on as a future star?
That is a tough question. Not one individual or organisation springs to mind for me. I work with loads of organisations, and a common question that I get asked is who is the best at this in the industry, and what is the secret sauce? And I'm like, there is no one great organization. There are good organizations and there are terrible organizations. But there is like no one single great organization. But what we can do is find really great ideas and best practice all over the place. And my clients surprise me on a daily basis when they come up with new ideas of doing things. And my job is to try and share that best practice with my other clients, so that we can all benefit from those great ideas.
That's a great way of wrapping things up, Toby. I think from what it sounds like is that there isn't a fix-all for everybody, but there are things that you can get inspired by other people and apply and add your own flavor to because each organization's problems are slightly different to everybody else's.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah, every organization has got its own unique set of challenges. It depends on the culture of the business, the leadership of the business, the industry that they work in. All sorts of factors make a business unique. So you can go on Google and you can search diversity and inclusion strategy, but do not do that because it will not work for your organization.
Is your SEO not set up so that your website would pop up at the top?
I wish. It's not quite that clever. Just don't copy and paste what other organizations are doing. Come up with your own plan. Start with your people. Understand what their experience is like. Find out what challenges and problems they're facing and what barriers they're experiencing, and then build your plan from there.
Wonderful. Toby, that has been so useful. So many nuggets of pearls of wisdom. It's probably a better terminology that people can use. I'd love to do a follow-up with you in maybe 12 months' time to see how things have evolved in the marketplace.
That'd be brilliant.
Of DE&I and how employer branding is continuing to evolve as a practice. In the meantime, if people are interested in maybe having a conversation with you about how you could help their business or just following along on your content, where's the best place for people to go online and seeing what you're talking about?
So people can either go to my website, which is www.mildon.co.uk, where I've got loads of information about what we do as a consultancy practice, and people can get in touch with us through the website. And I'm on LinkedIn every day. So just connect with me on LinkedIn and drop me a message on LinkedIn.
Wonderful. And I'll put links to the website and your LinkedIn, so it's really easy for people to follow up on those as well, cool. Toby. That's awesome. Thank you ever so much for today. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thanks for inviting me along.
No worries, Toby.